Hi, Christine.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
Pretty good.
Did you have a good weekend?
I did have a good weekend. Doing a lot of house construction and remodeling. So it was a busy weekend, but a good one. So how about you?
Are you doing the work with yourself or with a contractor?
A little bit of both. My dad was actually up this weekend to help. He's really good at the house things, so we put him to work. But the bigger stuff we've had to hire out. So the house is a bit of a construction zone right now, and actually a little noisy this morning. So hopefully it won't be too disruptive during the meeting.
I'm sure I don't hear anything right now. So
Oh, that's good.
yeah, we have an old house, and it's a hobby as well, but it is a constant effort to keep it up. So I was
Yes.
and working on the outside, and the weather was pretty good. We're gonna have some great weather later this week, but for the next few days, it's gonna be really wet.
Yes, it's a pretty gray day today.
Yeah,
Gray Mondays are always tough. It's hard to get motivated.
they are. It's true. Kind of surprised nobody else is on. It's a few minutes after.
Sarah just came on. I'm going to move her over to a panelist. She came on as an attendee, so she should be joining here.
It took me a little bit to sign in. I don't know. It was sort of different this time. I wanted my email and stuff. I don't know.
Huh. That's unusual, huh?
Yeah.
I just checked in with Zaraya, but I didn't. I just texted her to see if she's having any issues. So.
I did notice it was.
Oh, she's
Zoom.
there.
She's there. She's here. Okay, yeah. Zoom in general seems to be a little slow. Like when I move you guys from attendee over to panelist, it takes like a really long time. So I don't know if Zoom is just very slow today, but I did notice that as well.
I noticed it was clunky too when I started. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's just a Zoom error, but we should be operating okay. Maybe just a little slower than usual.
Okay. Great. Hi, Zaraya. Morning.
My co-counselor.
Does your cat like the keyboard? Because apparently cats love the feeling of the keys on the keyboard on their paws.
I don't know. I don't really let her stay on my keyboard for very long. She did just turn the camera on. That was cool. And off.
All right. Well, we've got some participants joining us as well. So we will, in a minute, I think, begin our meeting. It is now, I have 10:05. So since we're all present and we have some other attendees that have joined us, I think we'll start now. And calling this Community Development Neighborhood Revitalization Committee meeting to order on Monday, October 19th, slightly after 10. The purpose of today's meeting is to revisit a topic that was discussed previously by the committee on September 16th, and that is the gathering of information on just cause eviction policies from other jurisdictions. And at that meeting, we discussed the scope of work, the estimated level of effort, and we decided to contract with Audrey Oliver to perform the research that we felt was needed. We then subsequently found out that the meeting was not properly warned, even though it was recorded on via Zoom, the recording feature, and that is a violation of the open meeting laws. So, this meeting is intended to remedy that unintentional violation of the open meeting law. And as the committee chair, I would offer a public apology to the community at large for the fact that this happened. We need to be focused on ensuring that we follow through on what the public needs and expects in terms of open discussion and debate of the issues. And this was a inadvertent error that occurred. So I will leave it at that. And now we can go into our agenda for today. Christine, I am hoping you will help me with the agenda. Does it go right to public comment, or do we talk about the scope of work? I don't recall, and I don't have my screen.
Yeah, so if you guys want to adopt the agenda, and then we'll move into a public forum. And just anyone who's attending, I did get some emails from people saying that they would be attending the meeting, but they didn't specify if they wanted to speak at public forum. So if anyone wanted to speak, you can use the raise hand function or send me a chat in the chat bar. But yes, public forum will be next.
Okay, does anyone, would you like to propose to adopt the agenda, Councilor Carpenter?
Yes, I would. I'll move that. I also want to point out, I think I have to leave about 11:10 or so for a doctor's appointment.
Okay, thanks for letting us know that. And is there a second to the motion to approve the agenda?
Sorry, did we just have a motion on the agenda?
Yes, to approve the agenda. Yep. And all in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, great. Agenda is adopted. And we will revisit the scope of work, but we'll do that after the public forum. So Christine, anybody queued up to speak in the public forum?
I don't see anyone. Oh, someone is raising their hand. They're labeled as Redstone, so let's allow them to speak and see who this is. They should be joining as a panelist here in a second. Again, it's slow this morning. There we go.
Okay, Redstone, you are enabled.
Hi. So my name is Leslyn Hall. Redstone's the name of my computer because it's the one I use for work. I wanted to, I've gone back and been thinking a lot about this issue and gone and read all the committee past meetings and documents on the just cause evictions and looked at your scope of work. And in some ways, the scope of work looks simply, well, it looks primarily focused on trying to develop a future ordinance, but I don't really feel like anything that's been presented to date addresses how this ordinance will address what seem to me the primary two reasons presented at the beginning of this process, having to do with capacity in the community and housing stability, and how those ordinances, whether that or not they succeeded in the communities where they were enacted, promoted both increasing housing capacity and community stability. And I think it's important to kind of come back to that and understand this, because as someone who's lived in Burlington for 20+ years, our incredibly low vacancy rate seems to be our biggest tenant problem. And I mean, and what we can do to create capacity and keep people in their homes is a big concern to me personally. And I was really taken by some of the legal aid recommendations in their own eviction report, which were focused more on suggesting that we enact policies for rental assistance, both in the terms of financial assistance to people and helping them get more legal representation when they face evictions. And still that seems absent from the scope of work. So I feel like the scope of work has jumped forward to assuming this is a solution to our problems, and yet does not go back to the original two problems that started this whole process. And I admit to feeling very conflicted about the issue of, as a community, adopting some sort of just cause eviction policy. And I wrote to Joan Shannon, and I wrote about my own personal experiences as a landlord in the city. And I won't revisit all of that now because my understanding was she shared it with the committee. But I do feel very deeply that we need to be helping people stay in their homes in the most effective ways necessary, particularly in this time. And I understand how that would create community stability if we can keep people in their homes. And that's all I have to say today.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. Christine, has anybody else indicated a desire to speak to the committee?
I'm just going to double check right now. I'm going to check my email again real quick. I have an email from David Edwards. He said he would like to participate. I don't know if he wants to speak, but maybe I'll move him over to see if he would like to. Again, he wasn't super clear in the email, so let's just see. I'll move him over to panelist now.
Dave, you're connected. If you turn off, if you unmute yourself, you can speak if you'd like.
I think I unmuted. Am I there?
Yeah, you are here.
Hi, hi Brian, how are you?
Hi, Dave. Good. How are you?
I just sent in a chat, and my first observation was that, well, first of all, this is a big issue and it's a complex one. And I'm not totally for or against it at this point, but I do recognize really the complexity of it. And then given that today's meeting is really to address the scope of the research, I looked at the time and funding that was allocated to do the research, being 45 hours at $15 an hour. And I really am concerned that no adequate study can be completed with that amount of money and in that time, and particularly given a deadline of October 30th, I believe. And I got these figures through Larry Miller's email. So I didn't see them firsthand through the committee. It was reproduced. So, I'm hoping those statistics are accurate if I'm relaying them. I mean, maybe you could tell me if they are. But it doesn't seem like a complex study of these issues can really be created and be, have a fair representation of all the 10 subparts and maybe even more issues that come up given the time and financial constraints that the committee's putting on the study.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. Christine, I'm not sure if you see any other hands go up. Any other people have indicated they'd like to participate and maybe don't know that they have to raise their hand in Zoom to do that?
Yes, I don't see anything at this time, but again, you can comment in the chat bar or the Q&A bar or use the raise hand function. But as of right now, I don't see anyone else wanting to speak during public forum.
Okay, as the committee often does, we will proceed, but people can chime in if they decide that they have something they really feel they want to share. We don't shut things down just because we're past the public forum portion of the meeting. That is just intended to be an early part of the meeting to give people a chance to share their perspective with the committee. So shall we go into and review the scope of work? I think if we could call that up as a screen share, Christine. Councilor Carpenter.
Well, I don't know if we want to just have a little bit of preface about sort of how we got here. I mean,
Great.
from my perspective, both you and I over the years have spent a lot of time on Just Cause. This is not the first time it's been before the city. I personally have worked in an environment for 20 years when all of the rental housing I was involved with had a Just Cause provision. So we went into this with a fairly narrow target of seeing how the city of Burlington might enact that, and we knew we needed a charter change. So that's what preceded this. I did not go into this believing that a Just Cause provision was going to be the answer to our tenant problems. I think the earlier speaker about rental assistance and legal representation is right on. I view those as state issues that the city needs to work on. They're not necessarily right under the scope of the city of Burlington. So moving forward, we decided that this was worthy of our exploration. And again, because I think all three of us have had quite a bit of background in it, we proceeded ahead. We did want to update ourselves on what other jurisdictions. There's been quite an expansion nationally of jurisdictions with Just Cause, including the entire state of California and the entire state of Oregon. So for me, this was really intended to be kind of an update on what we do. And I think it's important to point out, we went into this, each of our counselors, and the public may not be aware of this, we have a small amount of money allocated to us to do things like research. Rather than each of us Googling on our own, we decided to hire Audrey to help us more efficiently do that. Really, an in-depth study would be more under the purview of CEDO. And if that is something the city council would prefer to do with their resources, that's a question that could be asked. We're really limited to what we can do with our little small pot of money, just to make sure our facts are updated. And again, I think it's important for the public to understand what we're pondering now is going to the state and asking permission to allow the city to explore ordinances under the Just Cause possibility. And kind of that's where we're at today. On Wednesday, we're going to be talking a little bit more kind of around the details of what should be in a resolution to the city council. But I just think it's important to understand that this is not, we're not at a point where we're proposing fully fleshed out ordinances. Whenever that might be, which would at the soonest probably be next spring, there is a significant amount of work that'll have to be done by somebody, presumably city staff, to flesh that all out. So we're quite some ways from that. What we've asked Audrey to do is just provide us with the update of what jurisdictions have Just Cause eviction clauses, when were they enacted, kind of what's the bulk of what's in it. And that's, to date, pretty much what we've got. So it was really intended to be quite narrow and focused.
Councilor Hightower.
Yeah, I wanted to address two things. First, I did think that it's important to note that there were two violations. First, there was kind of an internal violation for us as counselors, and then there was the violation of the misunderstanding of the September meeting. And the first violation, I think, was a little bit because of this process, the charter change process. We as a committee passed language onto the charter change committee, and then I think there was some confusion around whether or not that meant that just cause eviction was still a part of our committee, or whether we had passed it on to charter change, and whether we're doing this as individual counselors, hence us using our counselor accounts or as a committee. And then there was a secondary, and so we discussed this research over email, and there's a public records request out for that. And then there was a secondary violation where we wanted to cure that violation. Meeting didn't get warned, as Brian elaborated. So wanted to clarify on that. Yeah, and then just to go in line with some of the questioning on this, I think we feel, at least I feel, I guess I will only speak for myself, as I feel pretty confident in some of the charter change language proposals and the discussion that we had there and what came out of it. And so there is much, much more work that needs to be done for the ordinance. I think there's always this question of putting the cart before the horse in terms of how much energy do you put into ordinance language before you know if this is going to pass by the voters and in front of the state. But because I think this is an issue that we're all passionate about and interested in, kind of to Sarah's point, we are kind of prioritizing educating ourselves around how some other jurisdictions have handled it, which is not to say that a lot of the other research, I didn't catch the name of the first speaker on the Redstone computer, but that's not part of the analysis that should be looked at, or to David's point that there's not more nuance that needs to go on. I think that this is not meant to be comprehensive or to say that those processes don't need to happen. And I think especially the first speaker, that's a good point. And going back to impact, thank you, Leslyn, will be important. So thank you for both of those comments.
Yeah, I would add that somebody once described the work we were doing at that time around energy efficiency, and they said there's no such thing as a silver bullet. There's just silver buckshot. You have to have lots of pieces, lots of approaches together that help address the public policy objectives. And in this instance, we have a housing market which we've continued to add actually significant numbers of new units over the last 5 years due to incredibly low interest rates and a rental market that was very robust. And with the addition of those new units, rent inflation continues to outpace regular inflation. We have vacancy rates that even with adding significant numbers of new units, has not approached anything close to what is considered a balanced market. So as we focus on production of new housing, and we see that it has limited impacts on the availability and affordability of the existing housing, we are really attempting to provide some level of protection for vulnerable populations. And that really is, since the 1980s, the Burlington's agenda has been characterized as sort of the 3 Ps of protection of the vulnerable, preservation of our existing affordable housing, and production of new housing. And you've got to really push on all of those simultaneously. It's not enough just to produce, evidently, because the market doesn't necessarily deliver the quality product to the people who need it most, who can afford it. So we've aggressively pursued every single housing subsidy available at the state and federal level. At the Burlington Housing Authority, over 2,000 rental housing vouchers are handled through our housing authority. 15 years ago, they had about 500. So they're adding significant rental subsidy to this community to benefit tenants. And by the way, rental property owners get about $16 million a year in federal rental assistance in Burlington alone. So it's not as though we're ignoring the other issues. It's just that we have acknowledge that the market has limitations, and as we add units that are market rate units and additional affordable units, we continue to see, there is a segment of the population that is at risk of not having their lease renewed because perhaps they have complained about code violations. There may be perceptions about the people living there that are just that, are just perceptions or stereotypes, or maybe even discrimination that's happening. And there are theoretically reasons why someone's lease doesn't get renewed, which are based on behaviors that people find objectionable, but they're not really illegal, or they don't really break the lease, but people just think they're objectionable. And what this policy says is, I'm sorry if you have objections to the person living there, that's not enough to put them into this market. This market is very hostile, very difficult for people to navigate, and the market that doesn't really necessarily ensure that they're not going to be homeless after they get their termination. So we're trying to address that segment and that piece of the puzzle. It's not a panacea. Nobody's pretending it's a panacea. I think we're going to be having much more dialogue as a community about what this is intended to do and what it's not intended to do, and what it's being done in parallel or in tandem with to make sure that we address the issue. It looked like somebody was put their hand up to speak. Yes, Joan Shannon did share, I believe she sent that along to us. I do recall seeing that. Leslyn, your comments were received by the committee, I think by the whole council actually. So the scope of work, as we designed it, as Councilor Carpenter said, and Councilor Hightower alluded as well, was really intended to give us the information that we felt was, our obligation to gather the information so that the people of Burlington would have more information about this policy. And so this policy is in effect in X number of other jurisdictions. It's been in effect for X number of years in these locations, and it's had this impact over time. And that's the type of information we were seeking to gather. I think we should run down through the scope of work in detail, because that was the purpose of the meeting on the 16th. We went through every item and discussed them. So I think it might be helpful at this point to do a screen share. And I think some of these may just speak for themselves, but I'll try and give a little background as to how we came up with these. I think we wanted to get a jurisdictional scan, is what it's called really, of who else is controlling evictions through either a state law or a local ordinance. Getting a table that compares and contrasts the various policies that are on the books, and what are those features that are common threads that run throughout. Maybe learn from others' experience about what has worked well and what has caused some difficulties and been challenging to implement and to enforce. So finding those common characteristics, especially in places that don't have any form of rent control, because that is the case here. And we wanted to focus on jurisdictions that don't have rent control, because that would be most relevant and applicable to Burlington. It's always good to look at what are the best practices that have emerged from the industry in terms of what is working and what is regarded as particularly effective in terms of having the impact that is intended. We obviously seek to have a brief that explains this detail. We specifically called out the states that have statewide policies in effect. Councilor Carpenter did her own research to make sure that we knew where policies were moving, and that in Oregon, New Jersey, and California, her urging was that we explore those in detail, because those are policies that have that are on the books for the entire state. The issue of rent increases is one that is always challenging because we're not seeking to impose rent control. However, if a tenant is given a rent increase that is clearly egregious and intended to force them out as a way to get around this policy, that is the issue we're trying to deal with there. I think the word egregious is one of those ones that's subjective. You kind of know it when you see it, maybe, but you might have a different idea of what egregious is from the next person. So I think we'll all acknowledge that item number 7 is one that is probably one of the most difficult ones to grapple with. Obviously, we want to address owner-occupied properties as a different subset of properties. I don't think we have unanimity on that, maybe on the committee. I know I've heard people in the community request that we address it. I've heard some say, what's the difference? If you're a renter, you're a renter. But I think that issue does deserve special attention and special treatment. Many jurisdictions have exemptions that say this policy doesn't take effect until the tenant has lived in their unit for a year. That's common, which isn't listed here, by the way, but that is a common provision found in many of the policies, that if you have a family member who is moving and wants to move back in to the, or move into the unit, that is a grounds for terminating a tenancy. So those are some examples of the exemptions. The lease renewal concept is one that was asked of our committee several times by both, I think, advocates and rental property owners. Does this policy essentially say once we've signed a lease with someone, they're in there forever? And that is, I think, is the ultimate question here, is does this policy result in essentially a perpetual lease? And the answer certainly from legal aid and from the advocates is, unless there is a lease violation, then essentially, yes, someone does have the right to stay put. And that is essentially what this accomplishes. So that is the concept. There are some in the council who've already expressed, real reservations about that idea. But that is essentially what the policy means. So there's got to be discussion about how do we craft something in Burlington that is, addresses our unique needs, perhaps. I had a discussion with someone just this weekend who said, I own a building. I've got 2 units in it. I don't live there. I would not be exempt. But I believe that there ought to be a sort of a more mediated solution between me as the owner and the tenant who's difficult. And they expressed that they'd had that difficult tenant. They'd had that conversation. It didn't go very well until they finally just agreed to part ways, and they made it, financially advantageous to the person they wanted to move on, and they essentially offered them some assistance financially as well as a reference, and they just parted company that way. So that was, a suggestion was to look at a more mediated approach that would be a very different policy than what we have here. There's a question here: why does the scope not include the pros and cons of this policy over time? I believe we actually talked about that. That's a question from Larry Miller. And I think that would be one that we could attempt to look at. I don't know, I think we discovered that doing your own original research on that question would be extremely time consuming and beyond the scope of what this committee and these 3 counselors have funding to do. But it would be the question, I think, that if there is existing studies and existing reports on that, perhaps we can just scour the landscape and see if we can find those. Councilor Carpenter, did you look at that issue of studies of the impact over time?
My knowledge is there was one done in New Jersey, which is the longest standing, and Audrey can maybe answer that, longest standing state with just cause. Most of the just cause jurisdictions have been municipalities, of which there are many. And there may be studies for the municipalities on the municipal level, but we did not do that scan. California as a state and Oregon as a state are newer, where the entire state is required to do it. New Hampshire has a sort of a lighter touch just cause eviction, which is also long-standing. So there's one, I think, reference to a New Jersey study, but we have not done a review of the others. There are, millions of federally assisted housing that has just cause provisions, and I don't believe there's been a study of that as well. And I think it would be sort of the pros and cons. We'd have to be a little more specific. I think there are many studies on rent control, but since this is not intended to propose rent control, we didn't look at any of that.
So there is a question posed by Leslyn on this chat here, that is there an option of expanding the scope to look at something other than requiring essentially the process to go to court? Is there something short of going to court? And that was my conversation with the individual I mentioned that I spoke with over the weekend, who owns a rental property, and felt like there ought to be something short of going through the legal process that involves a more mediated approach. We used to have a thing called the Burlington Mediation Project, but I don't think we have anything like that nowadays. Councilor Carpenter, go ahead.
I would personally totally support that. Again, it's sort of as an ordinance, I guess. What would be the process? Ultimately, every tenant and every landlord has the right to go to court. So that's kind of how you're going to cast your ordinance. I think in between that, you could insert mediation. So this doesn't presuppose that you could insert mediation. How and who would do that and how that would be paid for is a question of the day. Legal Aid, I know, has received some additional funding. This is more part of COVID, but they're actually asking for a statewide funding of more legal representation and mediation. It hasn't happened. To be honest, I personally am working on a statewide bill that has more to do with code enforcement and a statewide rental registry. And as part of that, there's hope that the fee you might generate would have more resources statewide to put into that. So I don't presuppose that mediation, we should have mediation. I honestly think that this is not intended to be in lieu of mediation. It's simply one aspect. I would suggest the committee could and maybe should investigate how we could increase mediation services in general. I mean, and really not just related to just cause. There's many legal reasons why a landlord can proceed with an eviction. And sometimes mediation would help that a lot. So I think that's a task that we should look at outside of just cause. I think it's, the obviously big one is non-payment of rent. That's 70+% of the evictions. Sometimes tenants just freeze up and say, oh gosh, I can't pay, and they stop, as opposed to bringing them together with a landlord and negotiating a payment plan or something like that. So there's a lot of work that we could, and I would personally welcome putting that on our agenda as a program the city might want to explore.
And there are some successful programs in effect already at some of the housing organizations. I'm on the board at Northgate, and I have been for almost 15 years. And they have never, in the 30 years the residents have had control over Northgate, they've not had a single resident terminated for no cause, never. And that's 336 apartments, the largest apartment complex in the state of Vermont, with many tenants who are financially struggling. So what they have done, though, is when people get behind in rent, they have a very proactive approach. They don't just let it languish for a month or two. They reach out and they have contact with them immediately, and they start to work out a payment plan. And they rarely, in the time I've been on, there's been very few even evictions for cause, let alone there's been no cause evictions. That can work for sure. I think Larry asked if we could look at the pros and cons, and what it raises for me is the question of resources and who does the work. Like we're counselors who have other duties, and so we ourselves obviously don't have the ability, and we have very limited resources to work with. However, we could ask CEDO. Luke will be joining us in our meeting on Wednesday, and we can ask Luke for CEDO assistance looking at this question of what are the pros and cons of how just cause policies have actually worked in other communities. I think that would be a question to ask for CEDO assistance with. So beyond that, the scope includes a level of effort, as was noted, of 45 hours. We just sort of based that on our work between Zariah and Sarah and I. We've handled hundreds of consulting contracts and contracts involving level of effort. So that's something that we felt like we could estimate that, and we talked it through a little bit and felt that was reasonable. The rate of pay was simply chosen because that was the rate that Councillor Hightower was paying Audrey as a research assistant for other work. So that's simply how that was arrived at. And we picked a reasonable completion date with enough pressure to get the work done, but not unreasonable amount of time, not time limited in such a way that it would be unachievable. So that is essentially, if there's suggestions or questions about this scope, or additional questions other than what have been shared so far, now's the time to share them with us. I've got a question here from Dave Edwards. Have you thought about looking at the impact on grand list values as part of the study? This would likely be more related to rent control, not elimination of no cause. Yeah, I'm not sure how that would be, how that scope would be defined to look at impact on grand list. I guess that would be, that's tough to decipher. I think it would relate more to the question of rent control in terms of what limit does that have on property values? Does that suppress the value of rental property? I don't know if there's a study that discusses this question of, does just cause on its own have any impact on market value of properties? I don't know that question has been explored. Do you think so, Sarah, in your research?
No, I've not found anything on just cause. All of the studies I've seen relate to rent control.
Okay. So there's some additional questions I think that have come up today. The one about approaching it less as a litigious environment, not sort of the non-legal approach, but more the mediation approach. And then the question that Larry has asked about what have been the impacts over time, the pros and cons. I would support a more of a mediated approach, but I don't know how you do that through sort of local ordinance. But I'm open to that idea through local ordinance. I just don't know if that is something that can be accomplished. We don't have a city attorney with us today, so anything we do right now would be conjecture and speculation. I'd rather not spend a lot of time doing that. But it is a question and an issue that I think does deserve further discussion. And I'm prepared on Wednesday when we meet, Wednesday evening at 5:30, same location, Zoom, to have Luke essentially answer the question about what can CEDO do to help us on this, this additional research questions that we don't really have the scope, the time to do with the limited scope that we've developed. Yeah, Councilor Carpenter.
Well, just on the mediation, as I said before, I think that's in and of itself something we ought to pursue. We can, I think the outlying legal question is could a local ordinance mandate that you go to mediation as opposed to court? And I think that gets sticky fast. I think it's most of the mediation programs I've seen, it can be offered as an alternative to going to court or pre-going to court, and then I guess if it falls apart. So I think it's a worthy exploration, and between now and Wednesday, maybe we can answer the question of could an ordinance require it, so we would understand that answer. But I just think in general for the committee, I think we should put that on our work plan and think about, is there a way to offer that service more robustly in Burlington? And that will take research onto itself, understanding the work that is already happening statewide to do some of that.
Yeah, that issue does go beyond just cause for sure. I would note that Dave Edwards, who's on this call, he might know something about this as an attorney, and I know that Dave and I were involved 20 plus years ago with a property owner who was challenging, and he was not willing to mediate. So you have to have willing parties, and that is the key with mediation. Is without two willing parties, it's essentially not. It's not mediation if it's not two willing parties.
Yeah. I need to refresh my memory, but is that not what some of what the Housing Board of Review does for security deposits?
They do essentially arbitrate. They arbitrate. They listen to the evidence and then they decide, and they issue a decision, which is a legally enforceable decision.
Okay.
You have to then appeal that decision to Superior Court, I believe. Housing Board of Review is not a mediation but an arbitration. Yeah. Okay. Is there more the committee wishes to discuss, or are there any members of the public who wish to address the committee before we wrap up? Christine, you're not seeing anything that I'm missing, right?
It looks like we have someone raising their hand. Leslyn is raising her hand. I don't know if she'd like to speak again. Should I move her over?
Yes, please. Okay, Leslyn, you're on.
So, like, this has been such an interesting discussion, and like, I really urge you to think more about the issue of mediation and the willingness. I mean, my own personal experience was we had tenants engaging in illegal activity, and because we did not witness it or experience it, we're limited as landlords in what we could do, even though we were being urged by other tenants to do something about it. But the other tenants were not willing to go to the police department. And I could understand their position too. And the police department wasn't able to do anything to help us. Like, I keep, in my mind, I come back to how hard it was. Eventually, they just moved on. But we couldn't do anything to help the people asking for help. And so, and I know like a charter changes first and then the ordinance, but part of me thinks like when we think about the charter change, we need to have a vision about what this is going to mean in implementation. And if the scope could possibly look at how other jurisdictions has sought to be able to, because it's not just the landlords who sometimes want other tenants not to be renewed. Sometimes it's other tenants in the building or in a complex. Like, what can we do to support them too? And when I was reading your research notes that are posted as public, is like, don't go too much into this because that will sink your charter, or that will sink this law being passed. I do think as a community, we should know sort of how other people have approached this, because one of the things I love about living in Burlington is I feel like we've been at the forefront of so many really positive changes in our society. And this is an area that we have, again, to be a model. We could really do this right for people. And I really so value the work that all of you are doing and trying to do this right to help protect our most vulnerable population. Like, in my heart of hearts, I cannot thank you enough for being city councilors and taking this on, because it is a thankless job.
Thank you.
And this is a hard issue, and I want us to get it right. And that's kind of all I say, because it was one of the most heart-wrenching periods of time to have other people ask me to do something and not be able to. So thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Carpenter.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Leslyn. And one of the dilemmas is when you say research the impact. I mean, this already exists. For example, there's over 2,000 units in the city of Burlington now. Those that participate, for instance, in the low-income housing tax credit program, that are governed by Just Cause. Those buildings have drug dealers. I can tell you from my many years, and they have the same dilemma, and the neighbors complain. And so, I mean, I think it's a worthy conversation about the difficulty of evicting somebody, and how does that play? How does that work? But I think that's kind of, again, it's for instance, should Vermont have a housing court? I mean, there's a lot of sort of depth behind that that we need to look at. How do you, it's going to sound awkward, better evict drug dealers? I mean, there are strategies for doing that. So my limited thing is that it's not been a community-wide impact. It's an impact on particular buildings over time. And how do you better deal with that? One of the things that we've seen or I've seen in other ordinances is enhanced cause reasons around nuisance. So one of the things that you can do, and like in that particular circumstance, is people coming in the middle of the night is a nuisance. So how do you proceed with that as an eviction strategy? So there's a lot of nuance there, which I don't think necessarily negates our need to look at having cause for eviction. It speaks to the system more generally. I mean,
yeah, and I should just address, I think Leslie made a really good observation that has been made before. The issue of whether we're going to get into the detail today or now in a charter is really the fact that we are a Dillon rule state, where the state has to authorize us to have certain power, many powers, or all our powers derived from the state legislature. And so what we're trying to do is get the ability to even look at this relationship or this issue from the legislature and then work out the detail, because otherwise we would bake into our charter, which is governed by the state. Every time we want to change it, we'd have to go back to the state legislature and get them to change it. And it's an incredibly convoluted process. So that's why we're trying to get this concept before the voters as a charter change, but not drill down to the level of detail that you need to in order to actually address the policy. You've hit it right on, though. We need to get into that level of detail. Otherwise, policy will be, it won't have the intended impact that people are looking for. Really appreciate that. Yeah. Councilor Hightower, you want to say anything before we wrap it up?
I'm all good. Thank you for the.
Okay.
And Councillor Pine, I'll just remind you that the motion made on the 9/16 meeting, if that could be made again here for this meeting, and I have the language pulled up if you'd like me to share my screen.
That'd be great. Thank you, Christine.
So this was the motion language you made to hire Audrey. So of course we just need it again for this meeting because as we know, 916 wasn't public or properly
Yep.
warned.
Okay, is there a motion?
I will move to authorize up to 45 hours of LOE by Audrey Oliver for completion of just cause eviction research as laid out in the document presented today.
There's a second.
Second?
Second by Council Carpenter. All in favor? Any discussion? Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, the ayes have it. All right, I again apologize. This was not the way things should go, and sorry that it went this way to anyone who's on the call, but also more broadly to the public. This was inadvertently a process that did not unfold the way it should, and we have taken note and will be much more diligent about both the warning of meetings and sort of email sharing of ideas, because that's our intention was not to circumvent discussion by the public or review by the public. It was solely to advance the research concept. Yeah, Councilor Carpenter.
I just want to point out, and we're going to have a more robust discussion on Wednesday, but all of the work that Audrey did is on the website. So it has been for a number of weeks. So we didn't intend to hide it. It's out there for folks who want to look at it.
Thanks for that point. And is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned at I have 10:59.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everyone have a good day. I'll see you all tonight for several hours. Okay,
Keep it to several. Just
I hope. All right. Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank you. Bye.